But there are some things that don't change, and the pro-independence camp have said that even if they break away, the Queen will remain the head of state for Scotland.
Well, the polling stations are now closed, so we'll be checking in with you throughout the evening. RT's Polly Boyker, they're live in Edinburgh. Thank you very much. And thank you for joining us as well. If Scotland does split from the UK, then the Union Jack won't just be lowered to half-mast. It might have to be taken down altogether. In fact, without the Scottish flag, the Union Jack would definitely lose some of its colour. So what could replace it? The UK's Flag Institute has run a competition for the best new design. And let's show you some of the entries. For example, this one here is adding a splash of Welsh to replace the Scottish blue. This one tries to unite all remaining home nations, England, Northern Ireland and Wales. And this option is based on the British coat of arms, with a lion and the unicorn framed by a rather elaborate wreath design. Well, whatever the outcome, there are going to be some major changes on the way for the whole of Great Britain. And talking of changes, we've now got a brand new studio to show you in London and the new home of RT in the UK. But don't worry, still some very familiar faces for you. RT's very own Bill Dodd right there together with investigative journalist Tony Gosling to try and help us figure out what could be in store for the kingdom. Over to you.
That's right, Rory. Changes could be on the way. According to opinion polls, there is every chance of Scotland embarking on the path of independence tomorrow morning. Well, as we know, this has been a very hard-fought campaign with vital questions on how Scotland would handle its foreign and domestic affairs. For example, defence and the nuclear issue, revenues from North Sea oil, and whether it'll keep the pound or have a new currency. So let's begin with the UK's nuclear deterrent Trident, which is located in a naval base near Glasgow. Now, the Yes campaign claims it costs a massive £250 million a year to maintain, money that could easily be spent elsewhere. Meanwhile, Better Together claim that if Scotland went nuclear-free, thousands of jobs and the country's national security would be at risk. Well, joining us now to discuss this is investigative journalist Tony Gosling. Tony, national security, surely this is a major issue. Removing Trident could lead to grave consequences for the UK's long-term security and make it very vulnerable.
Well, it's a bit of fear-mongering you're doing there, I'm afraid, Bill, because actually it's a deterrent. I don't think there's any real use of nuclear weapons is ever really likely. It's there to deter things from happening. Also, it's a fantastic amount of money they're spending. But there is a problem, obviously, with the base if they go for independence. And the Americans apparently have offered a base in Georgia, in the United States, for these submarines. And that actually may be where they go. And, of course, all of the impetus behind the entire Trident programme is coming from the US. All the money's to be made there.
But what about Scotland's ambitions to join NATO? Because if it rids itself of its nuclear capability, then that compromises its situation, because obviously NATO wants a nuclear power within its ranks, particularly protecting the Baltic states and indeed Scandinavia.
Do you really think NATO's going to want Scotland to leave? No, I think it's going to be very easy for the Scots, if they choose independence, to be part of NATO. They will welcome them with open arms, as, of course, probably will the EU. I think there's been a lot of scaremongering around that.
Well, another of the Yes campaign's key arguments is centred around oil revenue. Now, according to the Scottish National Party, Scotland contributed around £5.6 billion to the UK in 2013 from North Sea oil exports. Now, Scotland has only just been receiving just a fraction of that back. Now, they argue that an independent Scotland will gain over £6.6 billion in the first year of independence alone. Now, Tony, is oil, though, really a magic pill to cure Scotland's budget deficit? Because, after all, it will certainly have one when it becomes independent. And would it ensure long-term prosperity?
Well, let's look at some of the figures to do with oil, because there's about, well, the estimates are about £1.5 trillion worth of oil and natural gas in Scotland. If you think of how that adds up, that's just about covers the entire present UK national debt. So if Scotland goes independent, they're going to be keeping a fantastic amount of resources that Westminster desperately needs to pay off that debt. Now, let's be honest about that debt. It's never going to be paid off. So they've got an absolute gold mine there in Scotland.
All right, but what about those south of the border who've been denied any role in this referendum? People are worried about energy bills going up if Scotland becomes independent.
Yeah, but this vote is about the Scots and Scotland and their decisions. Obviously, if you know, whatever people in England think, they're likely to be wanting to get their hands on all those resources. But this is about Scotland and what Scottish people want and what's in their interests. It's clearly in their interests to keep this resource for themselves.
All right, another hot issue in this referendum is, of course, what currency a newly independent Scotland would use. Now, the SNP claims they could keep the pound. However, all the major political parties in Westminster have ruled out a currency union. Another option is, of course, the euro, but that's not certain either. Tony, this could be a major divisive issue, couldn't it, later? Because Cameron Miliband says no. Mark Carney, the head of the Bank of England, says no way will Scotland have the pound.
Well, this is one way I think Alex Salmons has really missed a trick, because there's all sorts of negotiations he could be doing as an independent Scotland. Say, for example, pegging the Scottish pound, the new Scottish pound, to the Norwegian krona. They've got a lot in common with the Norwegians and, you know, obviously with the oil resources too. And also, something that very few people have mentioned is the Irish pound. The old punt used to be pegged to the old English pound before it became part of the euro. So you've got all sorts of options there, and I think Alex Salmons really should have been pushing those rather than saying, oh, we're keeping our powder dry, we're not sure what we're doing.
Tony, one more question before we go back to our studios there in Moscow. Look, the UK is clearly progressing on a path of economic recovery, by all accounts. 300 years of a very successful economic union. Why go and fix something that isn't broke?
Hang on. Economic recovery? What economic recovery? If you look around the country, you'll see businesses going bust. Big cartels are doing well, but there's not an economic recovery on the ground. You've got working, you know, over a million families who are working now having to claim benefits. That's not a recovery at all.
Tony, thanks very much indeed. And we'll be back with more from Westminster, me and Tony, a little later in the hour. But in the meantime, back to you, Rory, in Moscow.
All right, to both of you, thank you very much indeed. In the weeks before the referendum, TV channels have been serving voters with their daily dose of alarmism. The newspapers have also been taking every opportunity to point out all the worst-case scenarios. Well, let's get back to our brand new studio in London, where Bill Dodd and Tony Gosling are right now. You guys have been following the press coverage. Over to you.
That's right, Rory. Now, that pressure has come from all angles here in the UK, led by the national daily papers, celebrities, public figures, and the mainstream British political parties. They have all in some way combined to try and persuade Scotland to stay in the Union and say no to independence. Well, as dominating the airwaves, the Scottish referendum has also thrown up more than its fair share of weird and unconventional stories in the press. Well, back with me is Tony Gosling for a lighter look at this. Tony, let's start off with the Daily Mail. It spins a line of all this being due to a crying Scotsman who's been jilted. It thinks that Alex Salmons' dumping by his English university sweetheart was what made him a staunch nationalist determined to destroy Britain. I suppose it's the sort of thing you'd expect from the Daily Mail.
Well, the idea is to try and get people to smile about this, but it's total dross and drivel, of course. And the other thing is, the three main parties all supporting the no campaign, my instant reaction would be to vote yes. What are they, you know, these are the guys that are really representing the City of London, Wall Street, the big financial powers of the world that want to get their hands on Scotland's resources. That really should send an instant signal to people.
But it's interesting, isn't it, Tony, that most of the national dailies were all against yes.
Yeah, but the Herald, for example, the Glasgow Herald was voting yes, which is a much more independent-minded paper. I mean, you have to look at the big proprietors of these newspapers. Where are their real interests? Because what's happening today in the mainstream press in Britain is you've got the appointment of editors and journalists who just simply reflect the views of the owners and the managers, not the people who are reading the paper. Right,
what about this then? The Mail isn't the only paper that has depicted Salmons as a potentially destructive personality. The controversial historian David Starkey was quoted in the Telegraph comparing him to a Caledonian Hitler. Clearly, there's a lot of anger against Salmond. Are Hitler comparisons perhaps becoming a little bit overdone these days?
Yeah, of course they are. I mean, this is just utterly ridiculous. But what actually the media have done here, I mean, particularly the BBC, have not done a very good job at all on this. I mean, is Nick Robinson still in his job? That's what I want to know. After manipulating the interview a few days ago with Alex Salmond, pretending that he hadn't answered a question when actually he had. I want to know, why is he still in his job after that? Of course, he's a Tory. He's part of the same system, which is Wall Street and the City of London, and he was the leader of the Young Conservatives, Nick Robinson. He shouldn't actually have that job. He's obviously biased. So look, the media have done a really bad job, I think, on this campaign, in really reflecting the interests of ordinary Scots.
All right, well, let's look back at the newspapers, though, and something a bit more positive here. Good news for the Scottish whisky producer, because according to the Mirror, North Korea seems to think that independence would be very good for their leader because he loves a wee dram. Does it really make any difference, of course, if Scotland's independent or not? They're still going to be exporting their whisky. I'm
not sure how much is exported to North Korea. Maybe more than before the communists took over there. But look, this is, again, just trying to divert people away from some of the real issues, and they haven't got to the nitty-gritty to do with just how powerful Scotland would have been on its own. I think the polls are looking tonight as if possibly the no has got the edge. And all of the campaigning, it seems to me, has been, almost all of it anyway...
Well, it's very early to say that, isn't it?
Well, yeah, but most of the campaigning from the big media seems to have been, even in these silly, trivial stories, to get people nervous, a lot of fear-mongering and silly things to say, well, no, look, of course we've got to be part of Britain. But actually, the Scots are an independent-minded lot, aren't they? They kept the Romans at bay for 350 years, and now the old gods are back. They haven't even noticed.
All right, well, as you say, we have no idea at the moment because you were thinking perhaps we might have an idea, but not until about 7 o'clock apparently in the morning. Right, but there will be some indications throughout the night
I think
as to how this vote's going to go.
Early polls, the exit polls, are indicating that there may be an edge, but we don't know, obviously.
Very early stages. The Business Insider newspaper, we talked about defence a little bit earlier, and it says that independent Scotland might be invaded by Russian submarines. What do you make of that?
I don't know how you have little Russian sailors jumping out of the submarines, taking over. Look, again, this is rather silly. I think also that there are quite a lot of Scottish regiments that can hold their own if they want to, and that the Scots will hold on to those.
So many former defence chiefs have said this could be a disaster. This could make Scotland very vulnerable, and indeed the whole of the UK.
But they're no campaigners fear-mongering.
And they know what they're talking about, don't they?
No, I don't think they do. I think they simply want to keep the resources of Scotland, and any excuse will be used by these defence people. Scotland is quite capable of looking after. Look, if, like I said, they kept the Romans out for 350 years.
No, just very quickly on a lighter note, remember that octopus, of course, that was predicting the football results?
Yeah.
Well, the Metro found another forecaster in the shape of a cloud, and not to be outdone by this exclusive, the Daily Mail reported a few days later on a piece of fried chicken, which apparently also showed signs of which way the vote will go. A small prediction from your point of view as well, Tony. Now, are you a superstitious man? I mean, we may laugh, but this could be more accurate than the opinion polls, because there's been a lot of controversy about the opinion polls.
Well, first of all,
absolutely right.
A straight question, no, I'm not a superstitious man, but I do worry about manipulations of these polls, things like postal votes, this kind of thing. And yeah, I mean, obviously it's good to have a bit of fun with these stories, but ultimately what really counts is whether the Scots have got their independence or not. Okay. I think that was what really matters.
Tony, for the moment, thank you very much indeed. Thanks for that. We'll be coming back to you a little later. That's it from our studios here in Westminster, but we'll have more, as I say, later this hour. In the meantime, back to you, Rory, in Moscow.
Well, thanks very much for that. All right, well, thank you for joining us here on RT International. I'm Rory Suchet, live in Moscow. The campaign has been intense and highly emotional, certainly over the past few weeks in particular. We now want to take a look back at some of what's been said. Let's cross again live to RT's new London studio. Bill Dodd and Tony Gosling are standing by.
Thank you, Rory. Well, this campaign hasn't just been led by the politicians and lobby groups. Even celebs in the UK have been stepping into the limelight. Sir Paul McCartney has already experienced one divorce, and now it seems he's reluctant to suffer a second. He's taken action by signing an open letter to keep Scotland in the UK alongside 200 celebrities such as Stephen Hawking, Sir Mick Jagger and Eddie Izzard. Well, Tony is back with us in the studio. And Tony, so there have been celebrities backing both sides, of course, but the No campaign has noticeably received a lot of attention in the media.
Yeah, it's a more spin, isn't it? I think that the idea is you put as many celebrities out as you can on one side of a campaign and people will vote for them. And I'm afraid I'm the opposite. If I see a lot of celebrities supporting something, I think, well, the opposite. I don't go with the celebrities, and I think actually ordinary people are probably wiser than they are.
But these are big names, aren't they? Let's just show you an example of what some celebrities have been saying.
Scotland, stay with us.
Independence right now is not a great idea.
Why?
We're in the middle of a huge, terrible, terrifying worldwide recession.
As one of the few Englishmen who's run with the Scottish flag with the Psalter around eight marathons through Scotland, and I'm just saying, I would like you not to go.
Now, these are famous people. They've got big followings. Do you think they could have more influence than the politicians?
Well, they certainly have a tremendous... I think, yeah, because politicians people just don't generally trust, do they? Like journalists, actually. But, yeah, they will. But this is all part of the spin, isn't it? This is the part of the public relations behind one campaign. And if one campaign has got a lot more money, it can spend a lot more money persuading more celebrities to come on screen and endorse them. This isn't really what elections should be about, or referenda should be about, is it?
All right, but Sean Connery, Frankie Boyle, Vivienne Westwood, they're all celebrities backing the yes side. But do you think there has been some discrepancy in the coverage of those supporting the independence movement?
Yeah, I think some of the people supporting independence, people will just look at what kind of person's supporting them. But ultimately, it's about the issues. It shouldn't be about personalities, and I think most Scots see right through that.
All right, we mentioned politicians and, of course, MPs. They've had plenty to say over this. And, of course, recently party leaders, they seem to get into panic mode. They played their last card when they rushed up to Scotland with promises of major power concessions to the Scottish government and also warnings of what independence would mean, likening it to a divorce. Let's have a listen.
Independence would not be a trial separation. It would be a painful divorce.
I've been divorced. More than once, actually. Divorce is a nasty, acrimonious and very damaging business.
The SNP says it is as much Scotland's ground as of the UK's. They are like the angry party to a messy divorce.
Of course, there's a feeling that they never thought this date would arrive, and Cameron's been accused of doing too little too late. But is this a sign of desperation, these last-minute messages?
I think it is, yeah. And actually, the whole idea of divorce, it doesn't have to be like that. I mean, in a way, that Scotland and England were sort of forced together in the first place back 300 years ago. It wasn't necessarily going to happen. I think countries are a lot happier when they're in federations. That is to say that they're together because they want to be.
But can I ask you a quick question, though? We talk about divorce and likening it to relationships, but without a doubt, families have been divided over this. Communities in Scotland have been divided over this referendum. It'll never be the same again. It could be extremely damaging for the social sphere in Scotland.
Well, I don't think necessarily, because this is a good, fair referendum that's happening, and that people will accept the result, I think. In other parts of the country, we've seen much more division. Say, for example, back during the 1980s in the miners' strike, real bitterness that's gone on for years. That's because it was a totally unjust decision. This, at least, the referendum is going to bring some justice.
Just briefly, one more question before we head back to Moscow. The Yes campaign has criticised Better Together for their negativity and false promises. Let's have a listen to this.
If people in Scotland want the substantial powers to protect our public services, create jobs, make sure we don't end up with Tory governments we don't vote for, then the only way to guarantee all of that is to vote yes.
We're ruled by the tyranny of the majority, and I'm afraid they're scared and stupid, the ones that vote no. They don't have any perspective.
Last-minute, cobbled-up promises from the No campaign, which unravel at the slightest scrutiny, will not fool anyone in this country, and neither will the blatant bullying and intimidation of the Westminster government.
What do you make of it, Tony? Do you think there has been too much mudslinging in this referendum?
Well, there's certainly been a lot, hasn't there? But, I mean, we've got this kind of pattern of referendums going on around Europe, actually. The trend over the years has been for Europe to come together under the EU, of course. The EU is not anywhere near as democratic as it should be. So, in a way, there's been a kind of natural wish for people to have their own independence, to not be sucked in to that massive superstate, what is effectively a kind of United States of Europe. There's also the big pressure last weekend, wasn't there, in Spain for the Catalonian independence. And I think that actually that may, many Scots are looking at that and thinking, well, actually, we're rather the same. We're similar in that we don't necessarily want to be controlled by a government a long way away. Labour Party have got something like 40 MPs in Scotland and the Tories only 1. So for, I suppose, for the Conservatives, really this is a win-win. If they vote no, then if there's a no vote, then the Tories are going to continue to control. If there's a yes vote, then they lose all those Labour MPs, don't they?
Tony, thank you very much indeed. That's it from us here in Westminster. We'll be back for you in the next hour with a lot more.
All right, Bill and Tony, thank you.
Healthcare prescriptions are free in Scotland, unlike in England and Wales. There is no privatisation of the National Health Service, unlike in England and Wales. So there are major differences, and we saw that as well with the war in Gaza, where the Scottish Government gave humanitarian aid to the people of Gaza and called on the United Nations to enforce a ceasefire in Gaza. Contrast that with the Westminster government, who did support the State of Israel in that war. So there are quite important divergences. And in my opinion, if an independent Scotland comes through, yes, there's going to be arguments about what sort of Scotland we want, but actually we can build in an independent Scotland which is more pro-welfare than the current situation in Westminster, where all the major parties accept this free market neoliberal dogma.
All right, Chris Banbury, political commentator. Thank you for spending your time with us here on RT International today.
Thank you.
Thanks. Well, whatever the outcome, there are major changes on the way for the whole of Great Britain. And talking of changes, we've got a brand new studio to show you in London now, the new home of RT in the UK. Don't worry, there's still lots of familiar faces. RT's very own Bill Dodd right there, together with investigative journalist Tony Gosling, are trying to help figure all of this out, what could be in store for the UK.
Well, Rory, changes could be on the way, even if Scotland does stay in the Union. As we know, this has been a very hard-fought campaign with exceptionally high turnout of voters, with vital questions on how Scotland would handle its foreign and domestic affairs. For example, defence and the nuclear issue, revenues from North Sea oil, and whether it'll keep the pound or have a new currency. So let's begin with the UK's nuclear deterrent Trident, which is located in a naval base near Glasgow. Now, the Yes campaign claims it costs a massive £250 million a year to maintain money that could easily be spent elsewhere. Meanwhile, Better Together claimed that if Scotland went nuclear-free, thousands of jobs and the country's national security would be at risk. Well, joining me now to discuss this is investigative journalist Tony Gosling. Defence, Tony, that is a major issue, isn't it? Removing Trident could lead to grave consequences for UK's long-term security and indeed make it very vulnerable.
Yeah, well, Trident is a deterrent and it's not ever going to be used. At least that's the whole idea, that's the whole point of it. And also, what are they suggesting? If Scotland goes for independence, are they going to join the Russian Federation? Are they going to join the BRICS countries? Is that really an option?
What about the jobs, though, that will be lost if Trident is moved?
Well, jobs are always an issue right across the country, and we do need to actually have a plan for jobs, not just in Scotland, but elsewhere. And that industry, I think, is a dinosaur industry. I don't think that it's really a long-term future for those jobs. You look at Dounreay, for example, the nuclear fast breeder reactor. That has been a complete disaster. That was sold as a wonderful project, still costing tens of millions of pounds every year, and they've got uranium and plutonium stuck in the core. What are they going to do with that? A lot of people have seen Scotland, right across the country, as Westminster's nuclear dumping ground.
Now, another of the Yes campaign's key arguments is centred around oil revenue. Now, according to the Scottish National Party, Scotland contributed around £5.6 billion to the UK in 2013 from North Sea oil exports, receiving just a fraction back. Now, they argue that an independent Scotland would gain over £6.6 billion in the first year of independence. Now, Tony, is oil really a magic pill to cure Scotland's budget deficit, because it will have one if it does go independent, of course, and of course its long-term prosperity.
Well, look, in the modern world, it's all about resources, grabbing resources, controlling those resources, because those you can tax. And of course, government is really all about how you spend that tax. The actual, in total, amount of oil and gas reserves in Scotland is roughly 1.5 trillion. Never mind your billions, 1.5 trillion. That's over the national debt of the whole of the UK, so they could clear that off over the years. They've got sitting on an absolute gold mine.
But Tony, it's unsustainable in the long run. It's going to run out one day, isn't it?
Well, the oil, of course, is, but there are other sorts of energy up in Scotland too. Hardly anyone in this campaign has mentioned that 80% of the national coal reserves are actually up in Scotland too, if we ever want to use coal in the future. It's a gold mine.
Now, another hot issue in this referendum has been what currency a newly independent Scotland would use. Now, the SNP claims they could and will keep the pound. However, all the major political parties in Westminster have ruled out a currency union. Another option is, of course, the euro, but that's not certain either. Tony, this is a major stumbling block, isn't it? Because Cameron, Miliband have ruled out Scotland using the pound. Indeed, Mark Carney, the head of the Bank of England. And yet, Salmond is saying to his voters, his supporters, he will have the pound.
Well, he thinks he will. This is where I think the SNP and the Yes campaign have really dropped the ball. Lots and lots of options as to what to do with the currency. Look at what happened in Ireland. For something like 15 years, they had the punt, which was pegged to the pound. They could peg the new Scottish pound, or whatever they want to call it, to the Norwegian krone, for example. And actually, the pound and the euro aren't looking too good, Bill, are they? They're faith-based currencies, I think we call it. They could have, in Scotland, a currency based on their own economy, a resource-based economy, oil, that kind of thing, and they'd be much the stronger for it. And they've really lost this. I think that the SNP and the Yes campaign have just dropped the ball completely on a vision for Scotland's currency.
All right, one more question before we cross back live to Moscow. Tony, the UK recovery, by all accounts, is well underway. The predictions are, if there's a yes vote, there could be a run on the banks. The markets could crash. Could this lead to an economic crisis for the UK?
Well, possibly. I don't know. I mean, the markets can be very, very volatile. But one thing's for sure, currency is what it's been largely about, this whole business. I think, actually, what you've got with Scotland is a real opportunity to do something with that. But oil and the currency, both actually part of the same deal. I would love to see the Scots bite the bullet and really go for independence. We'll see what happens tonight.
Tony Gosling, thanks very much indeed. Well, we'll be back with more from Westminster a little later in the hour. But for the moment, back to you, Rory, in Moscow.
Looking forward to it, Bill. See you both soon. Thank you. Now, in the weeks before the referendum, TV channels have been serving voters with their daily dose of alarmism. The newspapers have also been taking every opportunity to point out all the worst-case scenarios. And let's go back to our brand new studio in London, where RT's Bill Dodd and journalist Tony Gosling are right now following the press coverage. Can you take us into it?
Well, Rory, that pressure has come from all angles here in the UK, led by the national daily papers, celebrities, public figures, and the mainstream British political parties. They have all in some way combined to try and persuade Scotland to stay in the Union and say no to independence. As well as dominating the airwaves, the Scottish referendum has also thrown up more than its fair share of weird and unconventional stories in the press. Well, back with me now in the studio is Tony Gosling for a lighter look at all of this. And Tony, I'd like to start with the Daily Mail, which spins a line of all this being due to a crying Scotsman who has been jilted. It thinks that Alex Salmond's dumping by his English university sweetheart was what made him a staunch nationalist determined to destroy Britain. Well, that's a sort of human interest Daily Mail readers want to know about, isn't it?
Well, it may be what the property-owning classes, the Conservative newspaper, the Daily Mail, wants to spin to. But look, the media has played a crucial role in this, and they haven't actually told us really what's going on, I don't think. I mean, look at the way that the media now and politics are really joined at the hip with things like Andy Coulson, who was working at the same time for Rupert Murdoch, and he was the chief press guy in Downing Street at the same time. That's how joined at the hip they were and are. I think what the government are doing really is they're thinking that they can spin anything they want, they can do anything they want, and the media will cover them and they can get away with it.
But it is interesting that some papers obviously take different political angles, and yet the majority of the national press in the UK has been very much against a yes vote.
Well, that's right, because most of the big corporations, the big power players in this world, the banksters, the banks, they're the people who want to keep it all together. And there's been a few smaller voices which they're often drowned out by the big guys, the big multinational corporations.
All right, let's just go back to the Mail. It isn't the only paper that has depicted Simon as a potentially destructive personality. Controversial historian David Starkey, he's just been quoted in the Daily Telegraph recently comparing him to a Caledonian Hitler. Now, clearly there's a lot of anger against Simon, but are Hitler comparisons just a bit overdone these days?
Well, Starkey's got a bit of a crude technique there, hasn't he, really? Because actually he's going for the man, not the policies. Let's just ignore Alex Salmond for a minute, because this is not about Alex Salmond. It's about a future which may not even include the SNP at all. So it's about a complete independence. The idea of going for the man, for the individual, is because you're not prepared to discuss the real policies.
All right, let's look at the lighter side now. Good news for whisky producers, because the Mirror says there could be news for the Scottish whisky industry, as North Korea seems to think that independence would bring more whisky to their leader, who appears to love a wee dram. Now, really, does that make any difference if Scotland became independent or not? They're still going to export their whisky.
Of course they are, and I'm not sure how much the North Koreans really drink of this whisky. I think this is just a bit of spin. It's obviously an interesting aspect to the economy up there, and it's quite an important aspect, but it's not going to make a jot of difference which way they vote.
And we talked about defence a little bit earlier. The Business Insider newspaper reported that an independent Scotland, because of the defence aspect, the implications of what would happen if it became independent, Scotland could be invaded by Russian submarines. Now, that's pretty serious.
Well, and the Moscow Times today was saying that Scotland might join the Russian Federation. All a complete joke, but it does give them some independence, and you know that is what countries need. Small countries. We've seen a bit of a rush, haven't we, of Catalonia trying to get its independence from a referendum. Even Cornwall, also of course in the east of Ukraine, Lugansk and Donetsk. So let's make that comparison, and I think there are lots and lots of parts and small regions of Europe who are drowning in debt that are starting to think, well, maybe this is all a bit of a con. We need to actually separate from the big money people in Brussels and in London.
Before we cross back to Moscow, Tony, just got to mention this one. Remember that octopus that predicted the football results in the World Cup? Well, the Metro found another forecast in the shape of a cloud, would you believe? And not to be outdone by this exclusive, the Daily Mail reported a few days later on a piece of fried chicken, which apparently also showed signs of which way the vote will go. Now, we know the vote is looking possible that it could well be a no vote at this stage, but are you a superstitious man? Would you look at these sort of things, or would you?
No. Look, I'm not superstitious. This is kind of desperation. It's a bit of entertainment, but the people who really control the way people vote nowadays are these massive strategic communications firms, like PR on steroids, millions of pounds, millions of dollars paid to even win votes nowadays. And if you think that you can win a vote just on your personality, I'm afraid, and your policies, I'm afraid, that's history, that idea. It's strategic communications that wins elections nowadays.
Tony, thanks a lot for that. That's it for the moment from our studios here in Westminster, but we'll have more a little later this hour for you. In the meantime, it's back to you, Rory, in Moscow.
Yeah, thanks very much, Bill. We're just hearing right now the Queen is taking a special interest in the referendum from her northern retreat. Of course, you'll know it, Balmoral Castle. The Queen saying she will issue a written statement tomorrow. We'll check in with you and Tony very soon, Bill. Thanks so much for that. We now want to take a look back at some of what's been said. So again, let's cross over to RT's new London studio. RT's Bill Dodd and journalist Tony Gosling are standing by.
Rory, this campaign hasn't just been led by the politicians and lobby groups. Even celebs in the UK have been stepping into the limelight. Sir Paul McCartney has already experienced one divorce, and now it seems he's reluctant to suffer a second. He's taken action by signing an open letter to keep Scotland in the UK alongside 200 celebrities, such as Stephen Hawking, Sir Mick Jagger and Eddie Izzard. Well, Tony's with us back in the studio. Now, of course, there have been celebrities backing both sides of the campaign. But the No campaign has noticeably received a lot of support, hasn't it?
Look, I think actually the use of celebrities is a bit of a cheap trick. I think if you're voting on something as important as really going back to complete independence, where you can make totally your own decisions with all those resources we were talking about, actually it's important to keep to the issues and forget what the personalities, these celebrities, are saying.
Well, we saw some big names there in that letter. Let's have a listen to what some of those celebrities have had to say.
And stay with us.
Independence right now is not a great idea.
Why?
We're in the middle of a huge, terrible, terrifying worldwide recession.
As one of the few Englishmen who's run with the Scottish flag with the Psalter around eight marathons through Scotland, and I'm just saying, I would like you not to go.
So you dismiss what celebrities have to say here, but surely they have a lot of influence, perhaps more influence than politicians.
They do, I think, because people just don't really like trusting politicians, do they? Do they? No. And journalists too. Some of the least trusted people in society, and there's good reason for that. Actually, government in Westminster has been a bit of a disaster. The Westminster Whitehall bubble, absolutely disastrous, I think, for many people. I mean, for example, just to look at a few of the statistics, do we really want to be part of a UK where we have the highest rail fares in Europe now, where the rate of disabled poverty and fuel poverty is the highest in Europe? We've got the second highest cost of housing. Basically, Britain has become a racket, rip off Britain. And if I were a Scot, I'd be thinking I want nothing more to do with these banksters.
Well, plenty of MPs would disagree with you. Those who seemed to get into panic mode, party leaders, they played their last card when they rushed up to Scotland to say, look, we will offer more power, more concessions to Scotland if you stay in the Union. Regarding it almost like a marriage, let's have a listen to hear what some of them had to say.
Independence would not be a trial separation. It would be a painful divorce.
I've been divorced more than once, actually. Divorce is a nasty, acrimonious and very damaging business.
The SNP says it is as much Scotland's pound as the rest of the UK's. They are like the angry party to a messy divorce.
George Osborne there. Well, David Cameron, of course, has been accused of doing too little too late over this. Was this really a sign of desperation?
Well, yeah, but there's no comparison to a divorce. What on earth are they talking about? If two parts of the world want to go together, that's up to them, or if they want to go separate, it's up to them. This is actually shows just how little respect the politicians, I think, have for ordinary Scottish people.
Well, you raise a point about little respect as well, because the Yes campaign has criticised the Better Together campaign for their negativity and their false promises and the way they've conducted the campaign. Let's have a listen to what has been said.
People in Scotland want the substantial powers to protect our public services, create jobs, make sure we don't end up with Tory governments we don't vote for. Then the only way to guarantee all of that is to vote yes.
We're ruled by the tyranny of the majority, and I'm afraid they're scared and stupid, the ones that vote no. They don't have any perspective.
Last minute cobbled up promises from the No campaign, which unravel at the slightest scrutiny, will not fool anyone in this country, and neither will the blatant bullying and intimidation of the Westminster government.
Do you think there's been too much mudslinging in this referendum? It's got fairly nasty.
Alex Salmon's absolutely right there. You know, there has been a tremendous amount of fear-mongering. I think it's just really, that is one of the key things which will get people to vote one way or another way, is by pressing those fear buttons, and they've been doing that in spades, haven't they, from Westminster, from all the main political parties, which is, you know, to me immediately says, well, if all these political parties that have made such a mess in the whole of the UK, make a mess of the economy, and seem to be utterly in the thrall of the City of London, I would be voting the opposite direction to them.
All right, you mentioned earlier there are indications, unofficial indications, that this could well be a no vote. So whatever happens, though, what Alex Salmond has done, he's divided Scottish communities, hasn't he? The social impact now, neighbours disagreeing with each other, even families broken apart by this.
I don't think necessarily that's true. Actually, what he's done is opened up a debate about what are the various regions around the country. Wales will be looking at this and wondering, scratching their heads, thinking, well, what about us? Maybe we would like a vote about independence. So he's opened up a debate. He's done a really good job, I think, in that. But he's really missed a trick on the currency. He could have been really imaginative on what to do with that.
Tony Gosling, thank you very much indeed. Well, that is it from us here in Westminster. We'll be back for more in the next hour.
See you soon.